I hadn't been back to Cedar Hollow in 28 years, and the first thing my brother did when he saw me was lift a piece of poster board that read, "Look who finally remembered us." He held it high enough for strangers to read, like I was a late flight instead of a sister. For a second, I actually considered turning around and walking straight back through security. I'm Dr. Eliza Hartnow, cardiothoracic surgeon, department head, keynote speaker at conferences with name tags and polite applause. I have a life in Seattle, 2 grown sons, a townhouse overlooking the water. But standing there under the harsh fluorescent lights of Gate 12, clutching the handle of my carry-on, I was 17 again. The girl who left in the middle of the night with one suitcase and a bruise on her cheek no one ever asked about. Daniel stood 20 feet away, older, broader, gray threading through his beard. Time had deepened his lines, but not softened his eyes. Those eyes had watched me walk down the driveway all those years ago and had done nothing. Not one word. Not one step forward. I walked toward him because I refused to retreat anymore. "Daniel," I said, steady as steel though my pulse hammered in my ears. He lowered the sign slowly, as if disappointed I hadn't reacted. "Didn't think you'd come," he replied. "Figured you'd send flowers and another excuse." Our father had died 3 days earlier. A stroke, sudden and final. Daniel's voice carried that brittle edge of someone who'd rehearsed his resentment for decades. "You always were good at disappearing." I swallowed what I wanted to say, that I hadn't disappeared, I had survived. Instead, I told him I came because there were things that needed to be handled face to face. He laughed under his breath. "You mean the will?" I didn't answer. He grabbed my suitcase without asking and turned toward the parking garage. "Cars this way. Unless the famous doctor prefers a rideshare." The drive through Cedar Hollow felt like stepping into a preserved photograph. The same diner with the crooked neon sign. The same brick high school where I once gave a graduation speech about chasing dreams. The park where I used to read on Saturdays to avoid going home. Daniel drove in silence until we hit Maple Avenue. "You changed your name," he said suddenly. "Eliza Hart sounds important." I kept my gaze on the passing houses. "It's my married name," I answered evenly. "I kept it after the divorce." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Dad hated that you left." He never said it outright, but everyone knew. I turned to look at him then. "Did he tell you that?" Daniel's jaw flexed. "He didn't have to. But I knew something Daniel didn't. 5 years after I left, my father had found me. He'd shown up at my hospital during residency, looking smaller than I remembered, holding a paper bag of oranges like a peace offering. We had rebuilt slowly, cautiously. Phone calls every Sunday. Money I wired for his medications when his pension ran thin. Letters. So many letters. Daniel had never known. And in my suitcase, tucked inside a leather folder, was proof that would dismantle the version of history he'd curated for nearly 3 decades. The house looked tired when we pulled into the driveway. The once white porch railing had peeled into gray strips. The oak tree in the yard had grown enormous, branches stretching protectively over the roof. Daniel killed the engine. "Funeral's tomorrow," he said. "Reception at the community hall after. Claire and the kids will be there." His tone softened at the mention of his family. "They're curious about their aunt." The unspoken addition hung between us, the aunt who never bothered to visit. I stepped out of the car and inhaled the scent of cut grass and approaching autumn. "Daniel," I began, "you don't know why I left." He shut his door sharply. "I know enough." He headed inside without looking back. The funeral was modest, just as my father would have wanted. Closed casket. Military honors for his brief service in his 20s. Familiar faces filled the pews, some offering sympathetic nods, others whispering behind folded programs. I felt their eyes on me. Eliza who ran off. Eliza who chose ambition over family. Daniel played his part flawlessly, greeting guests with solemn gratitude. Claire sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. Their daughter, Madison, nearly 20 now, glanced at me with open curiosity. During the eulogy, Daniel spoke about sacrifice, loyalty, the virtue of staying. His gaze flicked to me briefly when he said that word.
Staying.
When it was my turn, I walked to the pulpit with legs that felt like glass. I spoke about complexity, about how my father and I had found each other again in the later years. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. I saw Daniel stiffen.
Good.
Let doubt bloom. After the burial, as people drifted away with casserole dishes and condolences, Daniel cornered me by the graveside. "What was that about?" he demanded under his breath. "You and Dad reconnecting?" I met his stare. "We talked every week." The color drained slightly from his face before anger replaced it. "That's impossible." "Is it?" I asked quietly. Claire approached then, tension etched around her eyes. "We're heading to the hall," she said carefully. "People are waiting." Madison lingered a second longer. "Grandpa had a photo of you in his study," she told me softly. "In a frame." Daniel snapped her name in warning. She retreated immediately. I watched them walk away, feeling the familiar ache of history pressing in. That evening, alone in the guest room, I opened my suitcase and removed the folder. Inside were copies of bank transfers, letters returned to me unopened years ago, and a notarized document dated 6 months before my father's death. He had changed his will, not out of revenge, not out of favoritism, but out of clarity. He had discovered what Daniel did when we were teenagers, the lies he told that convinced our father I was reckless, immoral, unworthy of trust. Lies that ended with me being ordered out of the house with nowhere to go. My father had written me an apology, shaky handwriting but unmistakably sincere. He admitted he'd learned the truth too late. He wanted things set right. He wanted Daniel to confess. And he wanted us, against all odds, to forgive each other. I sat on that narrow bed staring at the evidence of decades-long betrayal. I could leave at dawn. Let Daniel keep his version of events. Let him believe I was still the runaway sister who chose career over blood. Or I could stay and let the truth unfold. Downstairs, I heard the murmur of Daniel's voice, the clink of dishes, the life he had built in the space I once occupied. My phone buzzed with a message from my son. "Did you get there okay?" I typed back that I had. I didn't tell him that tomorrow would change everything. Daniel thought I had come back for closure. He was wrong. I had come back because I was done being the villain in a story someone else wrote. And when the real will was read, when the document surfaced, when the carefully constructed narrative cracked open, my brother would finally understand something he never had before. I wasn't the one who abandoned this family. The morning of the will reading arrived gray and heavy, as if the sky itself disapproved of what was about to happen. I barely slept, listening to the quiet creaks of the old house and the distant hum of Daniel's television downstairs long past midnight. He had always hated silence. It left too much room for thoughts he didn't want. I rose before anyone else, showered, dressed in a navy suit I wore to difficult meetings at the hospital, and packed my leather folder into my handbag. I wasn't nervous. Surgeons don't have the luxury of nerves. But there was a tremor under my calm, the kind that comes before a storm you know will change the landscape forever. Daniel insisted the will be read at his attorney's office instead of at the house. "Cleaner that way," he said over breakfast, not looking at me. Claire moved quietly between the stove and the table, her movements careful, eyes avoiding mine. Madison and her younger brother, Ethan, whispered to each other in the corner. I wondered how much they'd overheard the night before. Daniel had confronted me in the hallway after everyone went to bed, accusing me of inventing stories to tarnish our father's memory. I'd told him simply that truth doesn't tarnish, it clarifies.
He didn't like that.
The law office sat on Main Street above a bakery that used to sell cinnamon rolls the size of my head when I was a child. The smell still drifted faintly up the stairwell. Daniel walked ahead of us, shoulders squared like he was marching into battle. Inside, the receptionist greeted him by name. Of course she did. Daniel never left Cedar Hollow. He was a fixture. Reliable. Predictable. I was the anomaly. The attorney, Mr. Caldwell, greeted us with solemn politeness. He was younger than I expected, early 40s perhaps, with precise glasses and a tie too tight at the collar. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to a long polished table. Papers were already arranged neatly in front of him. I noted the absence of the folder I knew existed elsewhere, the one filed 6 months ago with a different lawyer. My father had been strategic in his final months. More strategic than Daniel ever imagined. Daniel placed a proprietary hand on the back of Claire's chair before sitting beside her. Madison sat straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes flicking toward me occasionally. Ethan stared at his phone until Claire nudged him. I chose a seat across from Daniel, meeting his gaze evenly. If he felt confident, he masked it well, though I saw the faint twitch in his jaw. Mr. Caldwell began with formalities, acknowledgement of our father's passing, condolences, statements about legal procedure. Daniel nodded at appropriate moments. Then came the reading. "To my son, Daniel Mercer," he started, "I leave the family residence located at 112 Willow Creek Road, including all contents therein, and the majority share of my investment accounts, with gratitude for his steadfast presence and care in my later years." Daniel inhaled slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. Claire's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Madison's expression remained unreadable. I felt nothing yet. The first will was predictable. It was the one Daniel believed in, the one he likely ensured was on record locally. "To my daughter, Eliza Mercer Hart," Caldwell continued, "I leave my personal journals, my service medals, and the remainder of my savings bond portfolio, with hope that she remembers our better days." There it was, the subtle cut, the phrasing designed to reinforce the narrative. Daniel the devoted son, Eliza the distant daughter. I could almost admire the craftsmanship of it. Daniel glanced at me, with something close to pity. "It's what Dad wanted," he said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear. I waited until Caldwell finished the closing paragraph and folded his hands. "Is that the most recent document on file?" I asked evenly. He looked mildly surprised. "Yes, this was executed 12 years ago and reaffirmed." 12 years ago, I repeated. "Has nothing more recent been filed with the county?" Daniel's eyes sharpened. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said calmly. "I'm asking a procedural question." Caldwell cleared his throat. "To my knowledge, no additional will was submitted through this office." "That's interesting," I replied, opening my handbag deliberately. The room stilled. Even Ethan looked up. I placed the leather folder on the table, but didn't open it yet. Because 6 months ago, my father met with attorney Raymond Foster in Brookhaven. A new will was drafted and officially recorded with the county clerk. Daniel's chair scraped sharply against the floor. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I slid a certified copy across the table toward Caldwell. "You're welcome to verify the filing number." The attorney adjusted his glasses, scanning the document. Silence thickened. I watched the moment comprehension dawned on his face. He turned to Daniel slowly. "Mr. Mercer, this appears to be valid." Daniel's complexion drained. "He would have told me, would he?" I asked quietly. Caldwell cleared his throat again and began reading from the new document. "To my children, Daniel Mercer and Eliza Mercer Hart, I leave equal shares of all properties and financial holdings, including the residence on Willow Creek Road and my ownership stake in Mercer Hardware Supplies." He paused, glancing at Daniel. "There is also a clause stipulating that full ownership of the residence may transfer solely to Daniel Mercer upon written acknowledgement of past misrepresentations made regarding his sister and a commitment to reconciliation." Claire inhaled sharply. Madison's head snapped toward her father. Ethan stared openly now. Daniel's mouth opened and closed without sound. "This is manipulation," he finally said hoarsely. She pressured him. I leaned back in my chair. I lived 2 states away. I didn't even know about the clause until I read it. That's a lie. Caldwell raised a calming hand. There's more. He continued reading. My father had included a signed statement describing intercepted correspondence and financial transfers unaccounted for during his illness. He didn't accuse directly, he stated facts.
Dates. Amounts.
Observations. Enough to raise serious questions. Claire's hand slipped from Daniel's. Daniel, she whispered. He stood abruptly. This is insane. Dad was confused near the end. There are 2 medical evaluations attached confirming mental competency, I said evenly. He anticipated that argument. Daniel's anger flared visibly now. You've always wanted this house. You hated that I stayed. I didn't hate that you stayed, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I hated that you made sure I couldn't. The room felt smaller, air thinner. Madison looked between us, as if watching a dam crack. Dad, what is she talking about? She asked softly. Daniel didn't answer her. He was staring at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. Given the existence of this newer will, the prior document is superseded. The county filing confirms its validity. The reality settled like dust after an explosion. Daniel had built his certainty on outdated ground. Claire rose slowly from her chair. We should go, she murmured, voice tight. No, Madison said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken with firmness. I want to understand. Daniel rounded on me. You think this makes you righteous?
No, Ian Suarez.
It makes things honest. He laughed bitterly. You come back after decades and tear everything apart. I didn't tear it apart, I said. The truth did. Caldwell began discussing next steps. Asset division, documentation, timelines, but his words blurred. I wasn't focused on property. I was watching my brother unravel under the weight of exposure. Not publicly, not yet, but privately, in front of his family. The clause hung between us like a lifeline and a test, confession in exchange for stability. As we stood to leave, Madison approached me hesitantly. Did Grandpa really call you? She asked in a near whisper. Every Sunday, I said. Her eyes flickered with something like relief and grief tangled together. He never mentioned that. I know, I replied. Daniel stormed past us toward the door. Claire lingered only a second longer before following him. Ethan trailed behind, confusion etched across his young face. I remained in the office a moment longer, gathering the documents carefully. Caldwell gave me a measured look.
This won't be easy.
I don't expect it to be, I said. Outside, the sky had darkened further. Daniel stood by his truck, pacing like a caged animal. When he saw me, he stopped. This isn't over, he said lowly. No, I agreed. It's just begun. For the first time since I arrived in Cedar Hollow, I saw something other than anger in his eyes. I saw fear. And beneath that, something fragile and long buried, uncertainty. The story he'd told for 28 years was collapsing. The question now wasn't about inheritance. It was about identity. And identities don't surrender quietly. I thought the worst part would be the will reading. I was wrong. The tension followed us home like a thundercloud that refused to break. Daniel drove ahead in his truck, Claire beside him, the kids silent in the back seat. I followed in my rental car, my hands steady on the wheel, my mind anything but. Cedar Hollow looked the same as it had that morning. Quiet sidewalks, trimmed hedges, neighbors who noticed everything, but something fundamental had shifted. The illusion of stability Daniel had built his life upon had cracked in a single afternoon. When I pulled into the driveway of the Willow Creek house, I immediately sensed something was off. The garage door stood half open, crooked on its track. A faint, bitter scent hung in the air, burned plastic and something sharper beneath it. Daniel's truck was parked at an angle, as if he'd stopped abruptly. I stepped out of the car just as a police cruiser rolled up behind me. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. 2 officers stepped out. One older, broad-shouldered, calm. The other younger, scanning the property with alert eyes. Daniel was already outside the garage, pacing. Claire stood near the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Madison and Ethan hovered in the doorway. What happened? I asked, though I already suspected. Small fire, the older officer replied. Contained quickly. Neighbor saw smoke and called it in. I looked past him into the garage. Cardboard boxes lay overturned. Metal filing cabinets stood open, drawers yanked halfway out. Papers were scattered across the concrete floor, some blackened at the edges, others damp from a fire extinguisher's foam. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It was nothing, he said quickly. I was organizing Dad's old stuff. Some cleaning solvent must have tipped. The officer's expression didn't change. Fire marshal found traces of accelerant. The word landed heavy. Accelerant. I met Daniel's eyes. For the first time since I'd arrived, he didn't look angry. He looked cornered. I panicked, he snapped defensively. There's been a lot thrown at us. The younger officer stepped into the garage, nudging a partially burned stack of documents with his boot. I saw a familiar corner of stationery beneath the soot, cream paper with a faint watermark. My father's old writing set. Daniel had been searching. For what? Not money. Not keepsakes. Evidence. The older officer turned to him. Sir, we're going to need you to come down to the station to answer a few questions. Claire made a small sound in her throat. Madison's face went pale. This is ridiculous, Daniel protested, but there was no conviction in it. It was an accident. Maybe, the officer said evenly. We'll sort that out. I watched as they guided my brother toward the cruiser. He didn't resist. He didn't look at me, but I knew. He'd hoped the fire would erase something. Destroy documents. Eliminate proof before the legal process gained momentum. It was a desperate move, reckless and sloppy. Not the calculated manipulation of years past. This was fear. Claire turned to me as the cruiser door shut. What's happening? She asked, her voice trembling. I didn't sugarcoat it. He tried to destroy paperwork. Her eyes widened. What paperwork? I held her gaze. The kind that proves he hasn't been honest. Madison stepped forward. About you. Yes, I answered quietly. About me. And about Grandpa. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Dad wouldn't. Ethan, Claire cut in softly, but her certainty had fractured. The fire crew finished their assessment quickly. Minimal damage. Cosmetic.
Contained.
But symbolism doesn't measure in square footage. The garage was where our father kept records. Business ledgers. Old contracts. Personal journals. Once Daniel moved them from the study. He thought I didn't know that. He underestimated how much I had learned over the years. I walked into the garage once the officials cleared it. The air still smelled scorched. I crouched and picked up a damp page. The ink had run but was still legible in places.
A date.
10 years ago. A note about a bank withdrawal that didn't align with medical expenses. My father had noticed. Daniel must have found the same page. I stood slowly. The damage wasn't catastrophic. Not enough to erase what had already been documented legally. Not enough to undo the county filing. But enough to show intent. And intent mattered. By evening, word had spread through Cedar Hollow. It always did. Small towns thrive on narrative, and this one had just been handed a new chapter. The devoted son. The returned daughter. The suspicious fire. Claire insisted on going to the station. I offered to drive Madison and Ethan home so she could focus. She hesitated, then nodded. The children climbed into my rental car in silence. Madison broke first. Is he going to jail? I chose my answer carefully. That depends on what the investigation finds. That's not what I asked, she said, her voice steadier than her expression. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She wasn't a child anymore. She deserved truth. If they determine it was intentional, there could be charges. Ethan stared out the window. He said you made Grandpa hate him. The statement surprised me. I pulled the car to the curb outside the house and turned off the engine before responding. Your grandfather loved both of us, I said. But sometimes love gets tangled in fear and pride. Madison studied me. Did Dad lie about you? Yes. The words settled heavy between us. Inside the house, the silence felt different now, not oppressive, but suspended. Madison walked upstairs without another word. Ethan lingered in the kitchen, then followed. I remained standing in the living room, staring at the mantel where childhood photos still stood. There was one of Daniel and me at a county fair, cotton candy in our hands, arms slung around each other's shoulders. We looked inseparable. We had been. Before grief twisted him. Before insecurity metastasized. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Dr. Hart. A male voice asked when I answered. Yes. This is Detective Alvarez. Your brother has agreed to answer questions, but given the context of the estate dispute, we'd like your statement as well. I'll come in, I said without hesitation. The station smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Daniel sat in a separate room when I arrived, visible through a narrow window. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders curved inward. I gave my statement calmly. I described the will, the new filing, the financial discrepancies. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't editorialize. Facts are sharp enough on their own. When I finished, Detective Alvarez leaned back in his chair. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. Do you want to press additional charges regarding the financial allegations? I paused. This was the fork in the road. Yes, I said finally, but I'm open to restitution. He nodded thoughtfully. Understood. As I stepped into the hallway, Daniel looked up through the glass. Our eyes met. This time, there was no anger in his.
No arrogance.
Just exhaustion. An officer opened the door to his room briefly, so I could speak with him. We sat across from each other at a metal table. Why? I asked quietly. He rubbed his hands together. I thought if I could find whatever he left, if I destroyed it, things would go back. Back to what? To the version where you were gone. The honesty stunned me. You built your life around that version, I said. It was easier, he whispered. For you. He nodded faintly. I never wanted to take Dad from you, I added. I just wanted a place too. He swallowed hard. I know that now. Silence stretched between us, not hostile this time. Just heavy. They're talking about probation if I cooperate, he said finally.
No yal.
But charges will stick. That depends on what you admit. His jaw tightened. If I confess to everything, the clause? Yes. And you'd honor it? I didn't answer immediately. I studied my brother, the boy who once held my bike steady as I learned to ride, who later watched silently as I was pushed out the door. I would, I said at last. He closed his eyes briefly, like someone stepping into cold water. Outside, the evening sky darkened fully, streetlights flickering on one by one. Cedar Hollow would be buzzing tonight. Speculating. Rewriting loyalties. But for the first time in decades, the narrative wasn't Daniel's alone. And fire, I realized, doesn't just destroy. Sometimes it exposes what was hidden in the smoke. Daniel signed the confession 2 days later. Not just about the fire. About everything. I sat outside the interrogation room while he finished, staring at a crack in the beige wall and thinking about how strange it was that the end of a 30-year war could come down to a pen and a single trembling signature. Detective Alvarez had been clear. If Daniel cooperated fully, if he repaid what could be repaid and entered counseling, the district attorney would recommend probation instead of jail time. It wasn't mercy. It was pragmatism. The financial discrepancies were documented. The attempted destruction of property was obvious. Fighting it would only make it worse. When Daniel finally walked out, he didn't look at me right away. He looked older than he had just days before, as if confession extracted years from him in exchange for air. Claire stood near the vending machines, hands clasped together, so tightly her knuckles were white. When he reached her, he said something too low for me to hear. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded once. Madison approached me instead. He told them, she asked. Yes. Everything. As far as I know. She studied my face, searching for bitterness. I didn't offer any. I was too tired for that. Are you going to ruin him? She asked quietly. It was a fair question. I'm not interested in ruining anyone, I said. I'm interested in things being honest. Her shoulders eased just slightly. Mom wants us all to do family counseling. I heard. Would you come? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought beyond legal outcomes. Beyond restitution and paperwork. Counseling implied continuation. Contact. A future that wasn't defined solely by damage. I would consider it, I said carefully. She nodded, as if that was enough for now. That afternoon, we returned to Attorney Foster's office for the formal reading of the valid will, the one filed 6 months ago. The atmosphere felt entirely different from the earlier reading at Caldwell's firm. There was no illusion of control now. No false certainty. Just consequences. Foster read the document methodically. Equal division of assets. Liquidation of certain investments. Transfer options. And then the clause. If Daniel Mercer provides written acknowledgement of past misrepresentations and demonstrates a good faith effort toward reconciliation with his sister, full ownership of the Willow Creek residence shall transfer solely to him, with stipulation that it remains within the family line. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Claire reached for Daniel's hand. He cleared his throat. I've already provided the acknowledgement, he said. His voice was hoarse, but steady. It's part of my signed statement. Foster nodded. Yes. I have a copy. Daniel turned to me then. I won't contest anything else. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand speech. Just surrender. I felt something loosen inside my chest, not triumph, not even relief exactly. More like the release of a muscle held tight for decades. Afterward, Claire asked if we could speak privately. We stepped into the hallway while Daniel remained with the attorney reviewing logistics. I didn't know, she said immediately, about any of it. I believe you, I replied. Her eyes glistened. He always framed you as distant, cold, career-obsessed. I almost smiled at the familiarity of that narrative. It was easier than explaining the truth. I married him believing he was the steady one, she whispered. The reliable son who carried everything. He carried a lot, I said. Just not all of it honestly. She nodded slowly. I'm angry. But I don't want my children growing up thinking family is disposable. Neither did I. I'm not here to dismantle what you've built, I told her. I just won't accept being erased. Her lips pressed together. Counseling. Please. I'll come for the first few sessions, I said. After that, we'll see. When we returned to the conference room, Madison and Ethan were sitting closer to Daniel than before. Not hugging him, not consoling him, but present. That mattered. The logistics of asset division moved quickly after that. Daniel insisted on repaying the misappropriated funds from the business share he retained. I didn't fight him on keeping the house under the clause. The property wasn't what I had come back for. It never was. 2 days later, I visited the cemetery alone. Autumn had deepened while I was distracted by legal warfare. The maple trees lining the gravel path had turned a muted orange, leaves skittering softly across the ground with each breeze. I carried white lilies, my father's favorite. I stood before the headstone for a long time before speaking. It's done, I said finally. The words felt strange in the open air. So much had been compressed into a week. Decades of silence excavated in days. I don't know if this is what you imagined, I continued quietly, but it's honest. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring the edges of my coat. I thought about the man my father had been, stubborn, proud, flawed. A man who believed discipline was love until he realized too late that it wasn't always the same thing. He had tried, in the end, to correct what he could. That mattered too. My phone buzzed. A message from Madison. Dinner Sunday? Just us. No lawyers. I smiled despite myself. I'll be there, I replied. When I drove back to Willow Creek one last time to collect the remainder of my things, Daniel was on the porch. Not blocking the door. Not pacing. Just sitting. I scheduled the counseling, he said as I approached. Thursday evenings. I'll adjust my flight, I replied. He nodded once. Silence stretched between us, not hostile now, just uncertain. I don't expect forgiveness, he said finally. I know. He looked out at the yard. I spent so many years convincing myself you left because you didn't care. I left because I couldn't survive here, I said calmly. There's a difference. He absorbed that without argument. I can't undo what I did, he added. No, I agreed. But you can stop repeating it. For the first time since I arrived, he gave a small, genuine nod. Inside, the house felt less oppressive. Maybe because the lies no longer filled it so densely. I walked through the rooms one final time, pausing in my father's study. The desk where he'd written letters. The chair where he'd likely wrestled with regret. I gathered his journals, the ones left to me, and placed them carefully in my suitcase. On my way out, Ethan surprised me by stepping into the hallway. Are you really coming Sunday? He asked. Yes. He hesitated. Dad says you were really good at math when you were my age. I laughed softly. He's not wrong. Ethan's mouth twitched. Maybe you could help me with algebra sometime. I'd like that. Small steps. Outside, Madison waited by my car. Thank you, she said abruptly. For what? For not destroying him when you could have. I considered that. I had had the power. Legally. Financially.
Publicly.
I could have pressed every charge to its maximum. I could have insisted on full liquidation. I could have let Cedar Hollow witness Daniel's fall without mercy. But vengeance has a long echo. I didn't come back for revenge, I said. I came back so the story would be accurate. She nodded thoughtfully. As I drove away from Willow Creek for what felt like the last time as a daughter defined by absence, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel like a disappointment anymore. I didn't feel like a victim either. I felt untethered. Not from family, but from the version of myself that had carried their narrative for too long. At the edge of town, I slowed briefly near the old park where I used to sit alone as a teenager, mapping out impossible futures. I had built one of those futures. Not perfectly, not without scars, but fully. My phone buzzed again, this time from the hospital in Seattle. A reminder of surgery Monday morning. A life waiting for me that had never depended on Cedar Hollow's approval. As I merged onto the highway, I understood something clearly. Families fracture in many ways through silence, through pride, through fear. But sometimes they fracture because the truth has been buried too long. And when that truth surfaces, it doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it rearranges. Daniel would have probation, counseling, years of rebuilding trust with his wife and children. I would have shared assets and cautious Sunday dinners and a chance, however fragile, to know my niece and nephew beyond whispered rumors. It wasn't reconciliation wrapped in warmth and forgiveness. Not yet. It was something quieter. Accountability. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, that felt like enough.